Hello, and welcome to Watershed Moments. I'm Rhonda Pendell Charles, City Councilwoman, City of Annapolis, Maryland. And I am so thrilled today to have Professor John Hudgins with us today from Coppin State University in Baltimore City. And welcome, Dr. Hudgins, to Watershed Moments. We are thrilled to have you here today, and you're my first professor.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming from Baltimore. Yes. Now, we're going to start with the John Hudgins story, which went back a ways. Not too far back, but let's start from the beginning.
One day last week, the 17th, it goes back 67 years.
Oh, wow.
I was born in Southfield, Virginia.
Where is that near?
It's about an hour from Richmond and an hour from Raleigh. Best known when I left there for speeding tickets going down 85. Everybody I met that had a ticket in Southfield. And prior to 85, US 1 went through Southfield. So the only way you could go from north to south is you had to go through Southfield, and you'd have to slow down. And again, if you didn't slow down fast enough, you got a ticket. So that's where I was born, and grew up there. All black high school, all black elementary schools. I think they began serious desegregation the year after I left, which was in '68. Mm-hmm. Went to North Carolina, went to Duke as an undergrad, stayed there for 4 years, went to Carolina for a couple of years, and decided I really didn't want to be that educated at that point. I wanted to be, as I would say, I wanted to be more community oriented. Oh, right. And this was like in the 70s. I went to grad school in '72, and by '74, I was ready to do something else. Okay.
Now let's back up a bit. Okay. Let's go back to elementary school. Tell us a little bit about your teachers and what you remember vividly as a young child and some of your first memories there.
I had a wonderful elementary school experience. The elementary school was named John Groom after an older black man who had given the land. And of course, this was a dual system. We had the black schools and the white schools. One of the things that I remember that is always a contrast to my students is the number of male professors I had. I had my first male professor in the 3rd grade, and pretty much throughout the school, there were male faculty members there, male teachers. And part of that was just segregation. I mean, with a college degree, this would have been in the 50s, about the only thing you could do in the South was either teach. If you were in a larger city, maybe you could be a lawyer or a social worker, but we had a lot of teachers. And they were great. They were great.
Do you remember some of the names of your teachers?
Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, my first one was a fellow by the name of Mr. Pearson. And 3rd grade, he was, I think he was a graduate of St. Paul's College. He was probably in his 20s. You know, he looked like an older brother. But we had a great time, and I can remember, if I think about it enough, I can remember most of them. I think my next male teacher was a guy by the name of Mr. Dortch, and he was like 6th grade. And I remember Mr. Dortch specifically because my handwriting was terrible. And for the most part, I always had C's in conduct and writing throughout elementary school because I talked a lot. And Mr. Dortch was interesting because he couldn't write either. And his story was that when he went to school, he was left-handed, but they tried to make him write right-handed. And by the time that they allowed him to be left-handed, he couldn't write with either one. So he pretty much said writing wasn't all that important. So from his, there were two things that would go with that. You know, he would say, first of all, it wasn't that important. So that made me feel more comfortable. And then later on, people started saying, well, if it's bad writing, it's like a doctor, so you must be smart. So I learned to live with bad writing and focus on other kinds of things. But the thing I liked was we had a bunch of what I call very genuine teachers. They were not that far removed from where I was. Poor kid in rural Virginia, and I mean real poor, dirt poor. They understood that. But they were comfortable with what they were doing, and they believed in us. And I used to say, and I tell my students now, you know, even though it was a segregated system and all the officials, I think we had a black assistant superintendent who was pretty much for the black schools. She would visit all the black schools. But the superintendent, the Board of Education, all those, they were very white. And I used to say that my teachers, when they, even though it was a segregated system, when they closed the door, it was their classroom. So we talked about the things we needed to know. We learned the lesson, of course. But we had one fellow that was always my favorite, a fellow by the name of Oliver Greenleaf Walker. He was the assistant principal, older guy, gray hair, and by then he was probably in his 60s. He retired before I graduated. But he would close the door and he would talk about whatever, and he taught world history. And of course everything was related to the world. And this was during the time when the civil rights movement was beginning to kick off in a serious kind of way. And we would have questions and concerns about all of that. And he would be very frank about it. And many of our teachers gave us lessons about how to deal with racism. You got to be twice as good. You got to be twice as careful. You got to work hard. You can't take anything for granted. And they had a very strong optimism that they were preparing us for a world that didn't really exist at that time, that things would be better. And of course, it was interesting to struggle with the people who liked Martin Luther King, but were very hesitant to talk about him in the classroom. And of course, nobody talked about Malcolm X. So it was a very interesting experience. I loved it. When I look back on what we had, we didn't have a lot. And one of the things that sticks out about education is a relationship. You know, you can have the best books, the best equipment, but if you don't care about the students, if you don't try to reach them and understand them, it doesn't work. We had, and another story, one of my favorites, I'm going to go try to see him this week or next week, is my high school coach that I keep in touch with. And he became a father figure to everybody. And he would push us. But I remember we got hand-me-down uniforms. And I remember we were so excited when we got new uniforms. Now they bought new shirts, and they were new, but the helmets they got from some other school. And I can remember to this day, my helmet had somebody named Jeter in it. And yeah, you got somebody's name because somebody had it before we got it. But you put it on, and you went out, and we were so proud. And of course, we had our new jerseys and stuff. And of course, my senior year, we were state champions. Oh yeah, we were state champions. And we tried to get the white school down the street to play us, but they were scared, so we said. But they never did, okay. And we knew a few people on the team. We got along with them, but we never played each other. But, and then, of course, another memory that's related to that was when they did do the segregation, the coach at the white school had not been a winning coach. He was a new coach, young guy. But my coach at the black school, they invited him to come over to be an assistant. And of course, when they did that, a number of the more serious black teachers left that district. Yeah, I remember my coach went to Roanoke, where he'd been born, and he got a job as a head coach. I think our band director left. A lot of the younger, more activist faculty members or teachers, they left. And then there were others who stayed, and they endured. But it was kind of picky because many of them stayed at the high school, which became a junior high school at that point. And a handful of them went over to the senior high school as a small minority. And I think by the time my sister got to the junior year, they'd gone to a unitary system. So blacks and whites were going to the same school. All the kids of a certain age would go to the old black high school, which was now junior high school, and then as they finished that, they would go to the, quote, senior high school, which had been the white high school. But that's pretty much it. I mean, we were poor, we had our struggles, but as I learned early on in sociology, I tell people there's something called poor, and then there's something called po. And poor is, statistically, you don't have the money, you fit into a category. Po is you don't have it, but you got to make it anyway. So you find ways to, I tell folks, I didn't actually have to do this, but I know people who did. You have a situation where you have to dress up, and you got one shirt. So you take it home every night, you wash it, you put it in the oven, and you put it on the next day, and that's survival. Now, I didn't have to do that, but there were other kinds of things we had to do. I mean, nobody walked around bragging about being poor. We understood that people have to make ends meet the best way you can. And we didn't necessarily put people down. Every now and then you'd get teased if your clothes weren't up to standard at some point. I remember back then the idea was Converse,
Yes.
Converse sneakers. And I had very big feet. And that...
so do I.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
So I had to go to the store, and we used to have what they call fit-ems. You know, you go to the store, and whatever would fit, that's what you got. So I would come in with U.S. Kids and a number of other things that other people didn't have. But, and it was all in fun, because we teased people about whatever we could. And I'd take a licking for, you know, them cheap shoes, them brogaines, as we call them, and that kind of thing.
That's a word my husband uses. He's from the Louisiana, Texas area. So.
Bad shoes or brogaines, yeah. And we'd get, and the same thing the kids go through today. I mean, if you got cheap shoes, my daughter, for example, refused to wear shoes from Kmart. You know, no-name shoes. So, I mean, there was a brand thing even then. But we made it. We made it, and we teased, and I kind of had two things going for me at that time. One was I got smarter and smarter. My grandmother, who is all that I am, I mean, she crafted me, if you want to put it that way. Mother died when I was about 4, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah. And my sister and I, my sister's 2 years younger than I am, and my grandmother refused to separate us.
Wow.
During that time, a lot of people wanted my sister because they were going to raise her up to be a live-in housekeeper. Oh. And my grandmother refused. She said, I'm going to raise them myself. And she did. Wow. Dirt broke, could not read her name if you wrote it on her hand. But she knew the value of education. And one of the things she would do is when she would clean, she did domestic work. Okay. She had about 3 different houses that she would clean during the course of a week. And when they threw out magazines and things like that, she'd bring them home. And I got into those. I got to reading and looking at stuff and got excited about reading because we didn't have TV. So we had radio and leftover magazines, okay? But it worked because by the time I got to school, failed the first grade because I was very sick, asthma, bronchitis or something. So I spent a lot of time out of school. But by the time, the second time I did the first grade, there was a teacher who knew the family. And our family has a very serious educators or educators name in the community. Okay. But we weren't a part of that, okay? We were kind of the left out children. My grandmother was, her mother was. But the name resonated and they knew the name. So this particular teacher kind of took me under the wings and pushed me. And because I was in love with books and reading and that kind of stuff, I sort of moved ahead. And that became an advantage because even though people would tease the socks out of me, they knew I was getting good grades.
Well, that was part of your watershed moment time.
Yeah, yeah. I was getting good grades and I was a bigger kid. Okay. So the teasing went to a point, and again, we would tease about different kinds of things. And by the time we finished, everybody had been the butt of something. So, but that's the way it was.
Equal opportunity teasing.
Yes, yes. And we tease and do our thing, and then we're buddies. We go into class and do what we have to do. So those were good memories. The poverty was painful. The stuff we didn't have. We spent a lot of days cold. You know, we had one of those little heaters in front of the stove because little heater sitting in the middle of the room, which means, you know, the front of you is warm and the back of you is cold. Because it was an old house and the chimney nearly caught fire with the wood stove. So my grandmother became very afraid of that, so we used to have these little oil heaters, which I think other people use for bathrooms, but we use for heating the house. So we were cold. A lot of times we ate what we could find. But the bottom line was there was never any doubt that my grandmother loved us fully. And whatever, if we didn't have something, we knew it was because she couldn't get it. And that's always been comforting to me, and it's always been something I have tried to do with my children. If I can get it, you can have it. And as poor as I am, or as poor as I was at that time, I have no question that I was spoiled. I was spoiled. And I'm glad she did. Yes, I think it made me a better person. And some of it was because I was sick. You know, I was a sickly kid. I was.
But you played football.
Well, by then, as I got older, and they think I had asthma. As I got older, I got a little bit better. I got much healthier. I think in high school, I didn't have perfect attendance, but I got close to it. But the first few years, 6 and 7 years old, in first, second grade, I really struggled. And I think part of it was I obviously had some respiratory problems, and living in a house that cold did not help.
Right.
I remember my grandmother would wrap me up and put Vicks Vapor Rub. And she had this thing, she would put Vicks Vapor Rub on you, and then she would heat a cloth and then put that on your chest as well, so you get the fumes to kind of open it up a little. And I almost got that every night. And I can remember one night, I had it real bad, and I don't know whether it was bronchitis or pneumonia, whatever it was. But I was laying in the bed, and the bed was moving, and I was feeling like I was in a whole different world. And she ran up the street. And it was an interesting race relation story, which is why, people like me can never hate white people, okay, because it's a part of our existence. But the people with the telephone were the white people who lived at the other end of the street, okay, which is interesting, and that's the story we can talk about. But bottom line, I was going through all those changes, and my grandmother went up to the white people to call the doctor.
Okay.
And back then, the doctors made home visits.
Right.
And I can remember the doctor coming into the house and coming upstairs where I was, and he had this needle, whatever medication he had, but as he put it in my arms, I could feel myself getting better.
Wow.
Okay. And I always say, he didn't have to do that. Okay, he could have said, that little black kid out there, I'll have time, bring him in the morning. But in the middle of the night, here's this young white doctor coming upstairs with his bag, treating me, and that kept me alive.
Right.
So it's an interesting story of growing up in small town Virginia, small town South. You have a lot of relationships, a lot of things that are purely human.
So what made you leave? I mean, you went to college, but you left there for a better time, a better life?
Well, two things were going on. I was college prep in terms of my high school track. And I loved learning. I was excited about a lot of things. And Vietnam. So you either went to college, if you were a young black man, you either went to college or you went to the Army. And back then, when I first started, there was a student deferment. So I went to college, and I always wanted to. So it wasn't like it was something I was pressing to do, and it wasn't necessarily ducking the military. I wanted to do that. My grandmother was pleased because she didn't want me to go in the military.
Right.
So I went to college, and with the student deferment, and then a couple years later when they changed it, and it's interesting, I just put that together right now in my way of talking about it, that same doctor called me and told me to come in for an exam. And he gave me a 1F because he says with the asthma and the bronchial stuff you had, you're not going to be a good soldier. And it's interesting because I was trying to get an Air Force ROTC on one hand, and he was telling me that I didn't have the medical ability to do that. So again, kind of saved in a way because, there were a lot of people who went to the military who were sick because at that point, if you can walk and hold a gun or rifle, you'd be in Vietnam in 6 months, okay? And I had a lot of people I grew up with.
So you went to North Carolina, the
Exactly.
the contiguous state.
Exactly.
And 4 years there?
I spent 20 years in all in North Carolina.
Okay.
I went there in '68, and I left there in '87.
Okay.
And all of my education, my higher education, was in North Carolina.
Okay.
I left South Hill to go to Duke. Got a full ride, okay, which made it possible, because otherwise I wouldn't have been there. And when I left there, I went to Carolina and University of North Carolina to work on a master's. And I did the coursework and got fed up and decided I wanted to go into the real world. And there was some practical reasons in terms of, we were doing a lot of organizing, community activity. We thought the revolution was going to come soon. Of course, it didn't.
And it wasn't televised.
It wasn't televised. Well, some pieces of what we thought was going to be, but it wasn't televised. So bottom line was I left school, and I worked for 7 years as what we call a social worker. I didn't have a social work degree, but I had almost a master's. And I qualified in the state of North Carolina as a social worker too, which is the same as an MSW. Did that for 7 years. And
Came to Baltimore?
no. No. I stayed there. I was in Durham.
Okay.
Did it for 7 years, went through a divorce, and realized that this was an opportunity to do some other things in my life. Yeah, I was the kind of worker, I loved my clients and working with them and making things happen. Hated the paperwork. And I'd find myself, going up to the training room and getting the journals and coming back, closing my door, reading. Okay. And, I started saying, well, why do you have to sneak and do this? You ought to be in a position where you can do this. The other thing was I wanted to make a broader impact because I was doing the one-on-one with my clients. I'd work with them, and I had this what we call the work incentive program.
Okay.
And that was the forerunner of this work fair thing that they have now. The idea of people who are receiving public assistance, helping them to get a job so they become self-sufficient and that kind of thing. So I was working with people one-on-one to do that, and we had some successes. A lot of problems because the reason they were unemployed in the first place, a lot of times was poor education, poor health, and in some cases, a lot of children. It's kind of a break-even point if you're on public assistance. And I remember President Clinton talked about this many years ago when he did his first work fair thing, that the critical thing was providing daycare. There's a breaking point in terms of how much you need to pay for, how much you need to earn in order to pay for daycare and then get ahead. And we saw a lot of people, just recycling. They get bad jobs, they'd work 6 months, get fired or get laid off, they go back on public assistance, and then they come back. So I wanted to do something bigger than that, and research I thought was going to be a part of that. So I had an opportunity because of this change in my life to start over.
Okay.
And I was always interested in education. I always kept saying I was going to do it, but life happens, as they say. So I got a chance to regroup, so I went back to Carolina and talked to the graduate dean and some folks in the department. And I had done everything except the thesis anyway. So I went back and spent another year, didn't actually go back, but got re-registered official and completed the thesis. And spent about a year fumbling around. I think I did a year of divinity school in between.
Okay.
And then I went back to Duke to work on a PhD in sociology, stayed till 87. And from that point, I went to Hampton.
Oh, you're moving a little bit further north.
Yeah. Well, further than I was.
Right.
But not further than it started.
To Hampton.
Yeah.
So somewhere or another, you made it up 95 to Baltimore.
After Hampton, I did about
Hampton.
6 years at Hampton,
Okay.
sociology. I ran something called the Black Family Institute. We
Okay.
did some good things there. And then I made it to Baltimore. Now, I was, one of my things that I was running into in Baltimore is this northern thing. I come from the school of Malcolm X. North starts at Canada. And we got Upper South and Lower South. And frankly, I don't want to get too political, but a lot of the stuff that came out the last couple of weeks through the Department of Justice report in Baltimore tells us that it's Upper South. I always, because my kids are into it, oh, you're from Virginia, you're from down south. And I start saying, and the first thing I tell them, I say, you know that picture in, I think it was Selma. I think it was Selma.
The movie
Or
Selma?
either Birmingham.
Okay.
Might have been Birmingham. The case where Bull Connor, who is he, Birmingham or Selma?
Yeah. I can't remember exactly.
Anyway.
I can't remember, and I don't want to say and make a mistake.
That's okay.
But it's one of those.
One of those two.
Yeah.
And anyway, there's a graphic of this kid. After they turned the hoses on him, there was another situation where they had these big dogs, German Shepherds.
Right, exactly.
And there's a classic picture of this German Shepherd with his mouth in the kid's shirt. I don't think it bit him, but he was up there. And I tell kids, those dogs came from Baltimore.
Really?
They were trained, as I understand it, by the Baltimore Police Department. They lent them to Birmingham for purposes of this crowd control.
Wow.
Okay. And the other part of that, of course, is, well, again, historically we know that Maryland was not a Confederate state officially, but it was a sympathizer. President Lincoln put troops in the state to prevent the state from going Confederate. I think one of the first skirmishes, I don't call it a battle, but a skirmish in the war, was I think when the Northern troops came through Baltimore and the citizens attacked them. Okay, the Union, they attacked them. And President Lincoln decided that he could not afford to have a Confederate state on the other side of D.C. And you had Virginia, which was a seat. So he made Maryland stay Union. But the sympathies in many ways in Maryland were not. And when you start looking at the kinds of behaviors that we often associate with segregation and, quote, the Deep South, they were throughout Maryland. You know, I hear people, not our students now, but they talk about their grandparents. who couldn't try on clothes downtown,
Right,
who
right.
had to go to the back, who couldn't eat in certain places, who sat in the back with this, that, and the other. Matter of fact, as I recall, and this is what I read, I don't know it personally, but I think the whole Mason-Dixon line thing in terms of the train, when you left Philadelphia, if you were a black person, you got in the back because as you came into Baltimore, you were coming into the segregated South. Okay. But anyway, that's one of my little asides.
And
I'm
as a
constantly-
sociology professor, this obviously fascinates you
yes.
tremendously, and you've done a lot of research and a lot of work. And how do you get that across to your students now?
I teach the same way my high school teachers taught a lot of stories. Of course, the thing in sociology, you have to mix the stories with good data and good statistics, and it's there. We choose the right textbook, good textbooks. And most of them, even the intro textbooks, when you cover the race kinds of things. And I tend to use a textbook that is thoroughly integrated with race for the intro class. Many textbooks, you just have one chapter on race and that's it. This book, the one I've used, and many books are getting like that now, they recognize that there's certain kinds of dynamics in the society you got to consider in everything. So we get a race factor, we get a gender factor, we get a class or economic factor. So when we look at the family, we're not just looking at some prototypical white family. We look at families in general, but then we start to, how does race affect your family? How does class affect it? What are the gender differences in the family? So I do that throughout whatever we do so that our students, particularly our sociology majors, come away with that. Anything you look at in society, there's this prism or these lenses that can give you a different perspective. And of course, my argument is that we're not dealing with right or wrong perspectives, but perspectives that allow you to see different things, to ask different questions. And that makes you, in my mind, an educated person.
Now, have your techniques in teaching changed, say, over the past 20 years based on our own culture and what has happened in our own country?
I think some of the facts have changed. We've added information. I think my basic style, I'm comfortable with it. I haven't changed it a whole lot. Of course, we add a few things. Coppin has some of the best technology in the country. So when it comes to classroom videotapes, going online, pulling up stuff, taping the classes, using the electronic media, a lot of things we can use to supplement what we're doing.
I'm
But
a
my
Morgan
basic-
graduate. I won't hold it against you.
Well, I was going to forgive you for that, but I've done some teaching at Morgan as well, so I don't. It's like my thing about the North and the South. We're two institutions trying to serve students, trying to help young people and not so young people get an education, to get a plus that's going to move them ahead. And that's one of the things that took me to Hampton, to Coppin, and a little bit at Morgan that I've done, the HBCUs, because I know full well that most of the students who I see are going to benefit from their education. When I was at Duke as an adjunct or an instructor, teaching assistant, I knew many of the students that I saw in the classroom, they're going to make it anyway. They had already made it because of the families they came from. Right. I remember one kid who came from a very wealthy family in New Jersey simply said his father sent him to school to be polished. When he was getting ready to graduate, I said, well, now you're going back home to work in your father's business. He says, no. My father insisted I go someplace else and make my mistakes and didn't come back home to work. But it was made. He knew where his life was going to be. The kids I see at Coppin in particular, because I think somewhere around 60 or 70% of our students are on Pell Grants, which means they're among the poorest of the poor. So it means that if they get a college degree, they will see a major change in their lives economically. And because many of our students, I guess 80 to 90% of our students live at home anyway, or they live in the community. 65% of them, I think, is from Baltimore. Bottom line, they will see an increase, and their families will see a change. And hopefully they'll be able to go back into the community and do some things.
Absolutely.
And that's the rewarding thing about this, because you run into people. They now have families, they have jobs.
Right.
They got new cars. I ran into a kid yesterday who had graduated a few years ago. He'd gotten his master's in social work and had gone back to North Carolina because he was from North Carolina. He'd worked there, and he'd just gotten a new job up in Pennsylvania. And he was on his way there to get his new apartment. He He had a new car but wrecked it, and now he's decided not to get a car, but rather he's going to save his money and buy a house.
Okay.
Well, when you see a person doing, you know that life is coming together,
Yeah, absolutely.
and you know that education has made all that difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The one thing that resonated with me when I heard you on the panel at Anne Arundel Community College, the conference recently, you talked about trees and how it affects, especially in public housing, low-income housing, how it affects people's perspectives. And I thought that was fascinating. That was one of the reasons I asked you to come on the program.
Okay.
That really resonated with me because we have 14 public/low-income housing communities in Annapolis with a population of 39,000. And when I heard you say that, I thought, wow, that's incredible. I had never heard that before.
There is a whole, I guess, range of research that looks at physical factors as they affect behavior. And I think one of the concerns that I have, and I'm not unique in that, is that oftentimes we don't take those into consideration. You know, even when we talk about the effects of poverty, poverty means you don't have enough money, but poverty means so many other things, like where you're going to live, like what kind of water you're going to drink. And when you mention public housing, one of the things that's interesting, first we used to think was density, a lot of people living together. And I remember one of the city classes, sociology city classes I taught at Morgan, one of the things we decided to do was a field trip. So one Sunday afternoon we had a student who knew the city, and we loaded up in our cars and we drove throughout the city. And one of the things I realized is that the density is just as great in some of these very high income areas. You know, you can walk and you can go into certain areas of Baltimore and you got high rises going up almost 10 stories. And you can see the little windows like little cubicles, but they are what? I guess $200,000 and $300,000 each. So it isn't the space, it's the other kinds of things. And if you walk into one of those neighborhoods, and you can tell it, if you walk into a high-rise, high-income high-rise, and you walk into a low-income high-rise, you feel differently. The trees are part of it, the grass are part of it, the way the windows are made, the bricks. One of the interesting things was for a long time they were not allowed to put air conditioning in public housing. So you see people hanging, well, they tore down the high rises in Baltimore, but before they tore them down, during the summer, you see people hanging on the balcony and people out in the yard and trying to survive. When you go by the high income, you didn't see anybody because the windows were closed, they had the nice air conditioning, the big screen TVs. So it wasn't about the density, it was about the other things that were related to that. Another thing that was a part of that kind of study, and I did some looking at the general studies on that, was lighting.
Yes, I remember you mentioned that.
Yeah. Yeah, when you get, there's something called circadian rhythms, and they affect your sleep patterns. And when you don't get enough sleep, enough of the right kind of sleep, which is very critical in terms of darkness and noise, you become irritable, you act differently. And they even found ways that actually affects your actual health, your blood pressure and all those things. So you got people with no trees, you got people with light all night, you got people with noise all night, you got people in many cases with lead in the paint or other things in the water. So there's a lot of things that are going on to their bodies. And one of the things that I'm learning as I'm getting older and pay more attention to things, I wanted to be a doctor initially, but moved into this social thing. But the thing that's interesting is that we are biochemical processes. I mean, we're a bunch of chemicals. When you really break it down with water and carbon and a whole lot of things, but they're chemical processes. And that's why medicine works, because medicine affects the chemical processes. Well, when you introduce other things that upset those chemical processes, they begin to upset your behaviors. Okay, that's why when you smoke a joint, which is a chemical, you feel differently. You smoke enough, you go act differently, okay? Smoke too much, you'll go to sleep or whatever, even with eating. But all of that's a chemical process. So when you back up and talk about, well, how are these chemical processes, and we're talking about normal process, we don't even get into the illegal stuff. How are these chemical processes affected by your income, what you can buy, what you can eat, where you can live? So when you start looking at where poor people wind up living, there's so many environmental factors that are wiping them out.
Professor Hudgins, we could go on for hours.
Of course.
But unfortunately, we have to stop now. But I'm going to definitely have you come back and fill in some more blanks, because like I said, I was fascinated by the things you had talked about at the community college for the conference, and we're just so pleased to have you. I'm spellbound, and by just listening to you, I feel like I'm back in the classroom. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for watching Watershed Moments.